Hi everybody, nice that you tune in. My name is Baden. I'm one of the lecturers at this winter school, and I'm currently based at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And in this lecture, what I would like to talk about a little bit is disinformation, which has captured quite a bit of attention recently in public, but which is fraught with a lot of questions and problems that we might want to think about. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to run you through a few perspectives that have been proposed to understand disinformation, that each contribute in valuable ways to understanding the phenomenon, but at the same time all have important limitations and flaws that we might want to keep in mind. If anything comes up as part of this lecture, feel free to contact me. My email address is below. I'm always interested, so feel free. Just to get started, I did a little bit of a search in the Web of Science for a number of key terms that are associated with our current fascination with disinformation. Fake news, post-truth, disinformation, conspiracy theories. And you can see here quite clearly that there is a surge, an incredible surge of attention after 2016. This is a little bit different for conspiracy theories and to some extent disinformation, which has become more of a focus of attention a little bit earlier, but also these two subjects become much more prevalent after 2016. Things are even more dramatic if you're looking at Google searches, which reflect obviously not the scholarly attention, but public attention. Here you can see a huge spike in December 2016. Related to the American elections, arguably. But what you can also see is that there is constant attention to some of the other issues, especially conspiracy theories. So it's not quite such a simple story. So in order to try and understand this, a lot of people have tried to make sense of the current attention for problematic information, for incorrect claims. And one of the most prevalent metaphors or explanations advanced here is propaganda. Now, propaganda is an old concept, so using propaganda in order to understand a contemporary phenomenon raises a number of questions, right? The concept is brought up quite frequently, especially in literature like popular science, literature addressing the American public. And the story goes a little bit like this. This is a phenomenon that is mostly about national politics, the national realm, and it mostly involves political actors. Political actors are the peddlers of propaganda. They provide disinformation, they lie to us, they tell us untruths. And this is, of course, a narrative that we find not only in popular science literature, but we do also find it in academic research, right? Like, for instance, Oliver Boyd Barrett's very insightful book tries to understand a lot of the information as disinformation that is going around, as deliberately created, as seeded by politically interested actors. If asked why now, what is now the particular surge of disinformation about, these explanations typically point to the agents that are involved in the creation of disinformation. So politicians who apparently are much more terrible they are in the present, and who use their power, who use their position in order to engage in deliberate distortion. And of course we can all think of examples, not just Donald Trump, but there are a number of agents in the international politics who have been known repeatedly to peddle disinformation and to engage like non-truth. In order to be safe from this, or to counteract this problem of propaganda that we're encountering, in this narrative, the main narrative is really that we need to be skeptical. Not everything that political actors tell us is truthful. Not everything deserves to be believed, and in order to understand what is reasonable, what is believable, and what must be distinguished from fake news, from disinformation, from post-truth, from all these other phenomena, what we need really is independent media. And of course, Most of those commentators have in mind something like the Washington Post, who actually has this principle already in its masthead: democracy dies in darkness. So the job of the press is to counter those in power that are lying to us, that are being dishonest. And we need the press as the fourth estate to counter this. And then we need to apply our own reason, our own enlightenment in order to come to conclusions that might kind of be worth believing. Now, of course, one weakness of this argument is that the very same narrative also works if you turn it around and look at it from the conspiracy theorist point of view, right? There are a lot of kind of lies in public sphere. Politicians are telling untruths. So what we need is independent media. So we need to turn to InfoWars. We need to turn to Breitbart. We need to turn to kind of media, alternative media that are not under the control of power, of money, and we need to read it, what is available on the internet, and think ourselves and come to conclusions such as that Jews control America, which obviously is not a very useful contribution to enlightenment. So if we think about this entire phenomenon as something that has been majorly started by terrible politicians, such as in this narrative, of course, Donald Trump, but Donald Trump would usually find somebody else to name as a terrible politician. A much more forceful response to this argument is an old response, and most of the responses I'll give you today are actually old. And it comes by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt has already written back in the 50s that politicians are, frequently engaged in this exercise of not telling the entire truth, that there is a lot of problem in the Republic with controlling information. So this is certainly not a new phenomenon, right? So if we think about the present occupation with fake news, with disinformation as a propaganda phenomenon, it really raises the question, why now? What is different now if the main explanation that is advanced by this model, namely the interest by political actors to deceive us, is distinctly not something that is new, that has been among us for a long while. Moreover, Jacques Ellul, one of the smartest writers on the matter of propaganda as far as I'm concerned, and I very warmly recommend these books that I put up here, reminds us that propaganda is not just a matter of somebody trying to lie to us, trying to deceive us, but that propaganda requires an entire ecosystem that is marked by control over channels, by control over media, that is marked by a public resonance of the stories. So the idea that there can just be a person, whoever you want to have in mind, who steps up on a stage and uses propaganda and thereby disrupts our public sphere, is a very problematic idea, and it quite certainly grips too short. So looking at the first part of this ecosystem, Donald Trump actually himself has named a second major metaphor that is used in order to understand the current occupation with disinformation. He calls it the fake news. And in this story, the fake news is again a matter that is focused with national politics, and it is mostly rested in the partisan media. So media become politicians, media peddle their own realities, and media are therefore to blame for this entire situation. We find this explanation not only in Donald Trump, but of course also in an academic context. You can make the argument that indeed hyper-partisan media, a new understanding of partisanship in media, especially in the United States, but there are some examples also beyond the States, is maybe indeed something that is marking the present and that deserves attention. So for instance, Joachim Benkler and his co-authors explain a lot of the disinformation that they study in network propaganda as an effect of deliberate multiplication by partisan actors, partisan media actors. Now, what is of course important to notice that is this explanation not only works in the way that Trump uses it, you can also turn it around, right? You can also think of hyper-partisan media such as Breitbart. You can think of all kind of different media politics engagements, and especially in Eastern Europe, that's a very familiar story, right? There is a lot of truth and there's a lot of explanation to this mix-up between political and media interest. So here the story is that there is a little bit of a terrible conspiracy between the media actors and the political actors who deliberately distort us. So the story is more or less similar in a way to a propaganda paradigm, but the difference is that here the media are the key actors. Now, if the media are the key actors, obviously they are not part of the solution. So the free press is not the antidote to the disinformation pandemic. But what we rather need here in this narrative is what you could call media literacy. We need to understand how the media work. If the public is aware of how the media works, then they are capable of understanding things carefully, separating good from bad news outlets. And of course, what we need is fact-checking. We need the truth. We need people who go out there and confront hyper-partisan media, all kind of propaganda of disinformation with facts, with the good old truth. So before I go deeper into this, just one quick note of caution. There has been a lot of controversy about the term of fake news, and there are good reasons to say, as Hapgood Kut says here, stop talking about fake news. Fake news is not a very analytical term. It is a political term that deliberately tries to confuse two things that are really worth keeping separate. Namely, on the one hand, the fact that media frequently report things in a way that do not tally with your subjective view upon them, your experience. So the experience that basically the news is discrepant from what you believe to be the plausible or the better story or the more important story, which is completely legitimate, which is completely normal, and which derives from the fact that, of course, all news reporting is positioned and tells the story from a particular point of view. And on the other hand, the fact that there are, of course, disinformation, there are errors, there are cases of false news. And what basically the term fake news tries to do is to confound one with the other and thereby kind of explain whenever we feel that what the news writes can't really be like it doesn't really tally with what we already believe, that this is not because the news has a different viewpoint, but that is because the news are lying to us. And that is obviously untrue, and it is therefore a term worth avoiding, especially in a context that fake news or accusation against the media are actually part of the problem that we're talking about, all this anti-media populism that Benjamin Kremer has written about. So please be careful with these words. They are politically active. A major objection to the argument of fake news, of course, is that fake news are many. Right? Like there are a lot of different phenomena that can be regarded as incorrect, as disinformation peddled by the news. There are news outlets that actually just make an error. There are news outlets that take a viewpoint that isn't yours. There are things that are not news outlets that pose as news outlets and pretend to be news. And there are, of course, stories that purport to be news stories but are truly made up or propaganda creations. Right? And these are very different phenomena. And whether we are talking about hyper-partisan or misleading or sensational information, false information, information published by journalists in error, published by people who pretend to be journalists or not, are things that are worth keeping apart, as Rachel Morrow and Craig Robertson remind us. Moreover, we might actually want to have a better term for the particular brand of disinformation that is often confused with the news as it goes around, right? Like there's all this use of factoid information as like stuff that looks like it is news, but it isn't really news, that is going around the internet, that has never seen the hand of a journalist, for which Rojecki and Meraz coin a very useful new concept, factitious informational blends, if you want to look into this. But it really helps to be a bit more precise here. More fundamentally, of course, the entire idea that the news is the place in which the truth and the falsehood are separated as binaries is an old idea that has already long time ago been attacked. So, for instance, Gay Tuckman, in her seminal book many years ago, explained that in many ways objectivity or the appeal to the truth is in many ways in journalism more a strategic ritual, whereas like a better understanding of the news is a kind of the creation of an account that is verified, that tallies with the facts, but that has no demand, no claim to representing the truth in an absolute sense. What is also useful to keep in mind is that, of course, there are a lot of reasons why we can have biased coverage, why we can have distorted coverage, misleading coverage, that do not necessarily have to do with deliberate distortion, that do not necessarily represent propaganda. As, for instance, Hamann and Chomsky in their famous book explain, there's a lot of perspective, a lot of intramedia dynamics that result in more or less trustworthy, more or less accurate news coverage. And this is not quite the same as fake news. Actually, in a study that I recently published together with Katerina Stapuskaya, we were looking at how British, American and Russian media were covering the chemical weapons incident in Syria that you may recall. And there exactly found phenomena that you could regard as problematic news narratives in the sense that facts were disregarded, available information was discounted, and that we found a narrative that is very partisan toward like whatever the respective political elite in the respective country is proposing. And yet you can't really plausibly understand this as fake news, because the entire dynamic that underlies this production of very different news accounts in Izvestia, in The Guardian and in the New York Times is not a matter of deliberate distortion. This is a matter where journalists are trying to tell you the best possible story based on their evaluation of the information. But in the process of this and through the availability of information, through the preconceived ideas, there are a lot of errors and problems that get into the coverage. Right? So not everything that looks untrue, not everything that is problematic content-wise is a result of deliberate distortion. So what we would basically there propose is to think of this more as a cultural phenomenon that responds to the ecosystem, the belief system in which the media take place, where like a lot of problematic ideas, a lot of problematic coverage has to do with the preconceived frames, the understandings that already exist in a particular media system. Another metaphor that has been going around quite a lot in the talk about disinformation in recent years is the filter bubble. The filter bubble goes back to a book by Eli Pariser, in which he argues essentially that there is a strong influence of social media algorithms that selectively expose us to information, and they do this in a way that amplifies a kind of a very selective, a very congenial subset of information that is available on the internet. So we get the impression that everything that is around us supports our existing point of view, and that contrary evidence is essentially absent, when this is of course not true, and hence we kind of get a wrong impression, we get incorrect information in a sense. Not in the sense that this is necessarily distorted, but in the sense that it is selective and it is systematically selective, so we are deceived. What helps against this in the story, of course, is to build diversity into algorithms, to rely on fact-checking, to flag problematic content. In a word, algorithmic accountability. So we need to think about how we make sure that the good information which exists, which is available on the internet, actually reaches people and is not filtered out by the algorithm. Now, of course, unlike the previous explanations, this one has one major point going for itself, namely that it actually has an explanation for why this is a concern now. Right? If this is an algorithmic phenomenon, if disinformation is something that is massively more important because of algorithmic selection, then it makes sense that this is much more in the public eye today than it used to be like 10, 20 years ago. These filter bubbles, again, can be applied to all kinds of situations, right? We can live in a Democrat filter bubble where Trump is a sad character, or in a red filter bubble in which this is exactly not the true. We can live in a filter bubble in which migration is ruining our continent. We can live in a filter bubble in which everybody is turning vegan. This is, again, a very flexible concept. It's actually much more flexible than the previous ones, because in principle the filter bubble can pertain to any kind of political ideas or ideologies, and it does not require that there is a strong, powerful, monetized interest in our society that promotes this point of view. And we've seen in this literature a lot of claims that seem to lend credence to this argument. Say, for instance, Wosugi et al. Here, who argue that false news spread much faster online, that they are privileged by the way in which social media work, which would give us reason to think that maybe indeed the filter bubble is a key problem. Now, starting to make a few holes into these filter bubbles, there is, of course, also research that shows that the assumption under the filter bubble, namely that we get very selectively exposed to only congenial kind of information, is actually not very well supported. So Pablo Barbera, for instance, has long shown that in many circumstances, actually social media use increases people's awareness of discrepant information, of all kind of contestation, which would directly counter the argument of the filter bubble. I have myself, together with Moran Yahi and Neta Klikla-Vilenchik, recently looked at a number of controversies in Israel, where we found that it's not just that basically social media potentially exposes you to all kind of discrepant content, but that actually people deliberately take to social media in order to confront people that are of the different point of view, which is rather rare and rather difficult to do in real life, like now, without the help of social media. So there's this kind of attack communication across political camps. At least on Facebook this is quite salient. On Twitter it takes a different form. Different algorithms do this in very different ways. So at the very least, we probably shouldn't talk about social media as the cause of this. There are very different social media that act in very different ways. But even in those social media that have been normally blamed for the filter bubble, there are some question marks whether the assumption of selective exposure actually holds. In this vein, for instance, Judith Möller and co-authors have repeatedly found that if filter bubbles exist, they are really a fringe phenomenon. They are a phenomenon that is associated with extremist political groups, with the radical right and the radical left, and they are not like a pervasive phenomenon that we find everywhere on the internet. And Axel Bruns has actually quite recently published a book even asking the question, are filter bubbles real? Coming to the, very simplified conclusion here that, yeah, there are of course filter bubble-ish phenomena, but the topic is quite overrated. Which leads us to a close relative of the filter bubble, the echo chamber, which is often used synonymously in the literature or also in academic chatter, but actually denotes a somewhat different mechanism. Because in the case of the filter bubble, the main culprit really is the algorithm, whereas Cass Sunstein, who has brought the echo chamber into public awareness, the main culprit really are we. Because we have a tendency to interact preferentially with people who are a little bit like us, who share our values, who share our beliefs, and therefore we expose ourselves preferentially to congenial content, right? So the mechanism is similar. In both cases, both filter bubble and echo chamber bank on this idea that there is a selective exposure, that we are unaware of contrary information, of contestation, and that we become ever more confident in actually incorrect beliefs because we are unaware of this, so hence disinformation follows as a social consequence. But in the case of the echo chamber, we are doing this mostly to ourselves by curating our interaction networks, by linking our social media accounts only to some people. So this is not in the algorithm, it is in the fabric of social life. In this case, of course, what helps is to remind everybody of pluralism. If we remain aware that there are people of different beliefs, of different denominations in our public, and that we need to be connected, that we need to respect other arguments in the public sphere, then this, of course, can help to counter the effect of the echo chamber, and we might be able to get a little bit beyond this and be aware of also contestation and get a better understanding of the world. Now, to make holes in things again, there is this brilliant book by Catherine Kramer, The Politics of Resentment, which deals very much with the underlying cause blamed in the echo chamber, the role of identity politics. Right? And in this case, Kath Kramer makes a very pertinent argument that it is not really the lack of or the exchange of information that is at the root of the phenomenon of this kind of formation of very radical beliefs or disinformation-like beliefs, but it is more the selective evaluation and selective interpretation, reinterpretation of available information against like the context of people's prior beliefs. Right? So the problem in this argument would be not that we are unaware of contestation, we are unaware of contrary information, we are unaware of all kind of sources that exist that we could use in order to get better information, but rather, Catherine Kramer argues, we are very much aware of those, but we hate them. Right? We are not prepared to trust them. We are not prepared to give them bestow upon them the credibility to kind of challenge our existing beliefs. Right? So we are defending our beliefs deliberately against information that we very much have access to, because we do not like who it comes from, we do not like what it means, we do not like the political implications. And indeed, William Gambson many years ago has already made the argument that this mode of appropriation is quite common actually in political opinion formation, right? That basically we appraise information against our existing beliefs, against our existing knowledge, and come to conclusions that are colored in very fundamental ways by our prior beliefs, right? We disregard media, we disregard information, we based on what we already believe, not because it is kept from us by an algorithm or by our interaction networks, but because we don't want to listen to this. In this vein, what I've done together with Yossi David, a former colleague here at the Hebrew University, but now in Mainz, is that we looked at how this actually works in practice. So what we took as an example here is a case from Israel where during the Jerusalem Gay Pride Parade there was an ultra-Orthodox religious man here in the picture who stabbed participants, killing one of them in his political protest or hatred toward gays. And what we did is that we looked at how the very same information, the very same kind of commentary that was available was treated in different Israeli media from the left to the right. So we were looking at Palestinian Arab language media, the gay community itself, mainstream Israeli newspapers, the national religious / settler public, and the ultra-Orthodox like the hardcore religious public. And the interesting finding here is, of course, that you can see quite clearly that all of those communities are in principle aware of like the breadth of information, the breadth of claims that have been made, but they appraise them very differently. Right? They discount information that is unwelcome. They disregard claims that are in conflict with existing belief systems, and they bend the available information into shape so it actually fits what they already believed. Right? So in that sense, the disinformation does not originate from the social sphere around us, from the world around us, but it originates from within us. We are making our own disinformation. And we make our own disinformation by drawing upon existing cultural, ideological discourses, like existing beliefs that already define us. We are fully aware that there is contestation, but we domesticate the world, we bring it into our frame of reference, and thereby create understandings, create interpretations that are inaccurate. What might help in this case, of course, is again pluralism, but this is not a problem that you can solve. It is a problem that you can only work to combat on a continuous basis, because we as information users continually recreate the problem. Which gets me to the final metaphor that I wanted to talk about, which is not by Jacques Derrida. I'm just attributing this here to Jacques Derrida because Derrida wrote amply on the challenges of truth and the impossibility of deriving at a specific meaning, specific truthful sentences. So in a sense, post-truth is not a claim that he would use, but it is a claim that derives from a deconstructivist understanding of the public sphere, wherein truth becomes challenged, and wherein the idea that there are multiple truths, that there are multiple perceptions that are legitimate, becomes quite salient. So in this post-truth narrative, there are somewhat different causes again marked. So the idea here is that the source of disinformation in a way is personal, right? Like I'm creating my own perception. My own perception is at odds with other perceptions. The question of which of those are true and therefore disinformation or good information is a little bit secondary in this argument. But in a way, the fundamental mechanism here at play in this idea is an idea of information overload. There is too much information, there is too much data available. Already in the original argument by Derrida, right, there are too many meanings, too many potentials in the same sentence. There are too many possibilities for understanding the same situation. So what do? We basically position our understanding of the world. We appraise the world from our subjective point of view, and thereby create a solution, a selective story, an incomplete story, a very likely incorrect story, but a story that works for us. And that would, of course, imply that this is an eternal phenomenon that has always existed. We just care about it more now, right? So the post-truth in this argument, this is not a new phenomenon at all. Now, if you go a little bit further into this, you can of course read, for instance, with Doris Graeber's magnificent book Processing the News, how like this kind of personal domesticated appraisal of information works, and how the fact that we read the news from an existing point of view, from an existing preconception of what we are doing, similar to what I just spoke about before, what the journalists are doing, how this creates this particular outcome. And in a way, since this problem is unavoidable, right? Like basically we all do this in this narrative, we all perceive the world in somewhat different ways. The solution here is not to remedy the disinformation, but to tolerate the disinformation, or to tolerate that there is a wide range of truths that coexist at the same time, and that can all at the same time be valid in some way, so there is no remedy. And again, I need to make holes into things, because of course the idea that there are multiple viewpoints upon the world and that there are many ways of interpreting the very same fact, it does not mean that, of course, that there is no possible distinction anymore between true and untrue statements, right? And in a bit of a pushback against this kind of relativist argument, very recommendable book by Natalia Rudakova, Losing Pravda, engages the legacy of Soviet and then later post-Soviet journalism in order to argue that there is an ethic of truth, even where there is a lot of distortion, even where there is a lot of a lot of problematic information around, and that one of the key challenges indeed in the press as an institution, in the public sphere as an institution, is indeed to try and separate the informative, the good information, the verified, from other forms of information that are not necessarily solely untrue. They can also be of a different quality, they can be performative, right? Like not every claim that is incorrect factually is fake news. Some of these claims are just performances. They are trying to mark particular identities. They're doing a lot of different things. Not everything that is not literally true is disinformation, but that the distilling of valid information is indeed one of the noble and central causes of the media. And very much in the same way, Michael Schutzen argues that, of course, journalism very much still matters, because, of course, if post-truth were the case, if there were just like a bunch of different interpretations that are all good somehow, then journalism could pack up. And Michael Schutzen very forcefully contradicts this here and says, yes, there is very much still a point in journalism, exactly because of all the complexity of the world, exactly because there are so many viewpoints. It is of tantamount importance that there are still professionals who deal in information, whose job it is to evaluate information and to give us a broad, a multifaceted, but a true story about what's going on. In light of this distinction between different kinds of information and the critique that not everything that is not literally true might actually be disinformation, what I've recently done together with Benjamin Krämer and Nina Steindl is to try and understand the different roles of information in the context of conspiracy theories. The idea being here that not all claims made by conspiracy theorists, which we would conventionally regard as a case of disinformation, a particular case of disinformation, actually are very usefully regarded as information. There are a lot of forms of conspiracy theories that serve different kind of purposes that are not by their nature an attempt to kind of provide an alternative truth, and many of them do not arise from kind of any news-like processes. They do not serve any particular informative purposes, but they are geared toward other exercises, right? Like they're means for expressing political resentment. There are means for forming communities, for forming community identities, but not necessarily all things or claims that come in the form of conspiracy theories are very usefully regarded as disinformation. So with all this in mind, I'd like to wrap up by formulating maybe a few recommendations. I know that a lot of you are actually relating to disinformation in one or another way in your projects, and I'd like to make a few suggestions. My first suggestion would be to really distinguish disinformation from other phenomena. There are quite a lot of different forms of inaccurate statements that exist in the public realm. Some of them are usefully understood as errors, some of them are usefully understood as propaganda, some are better understood as bias, as conspiracy theories, as misleading, as hoax, as different forms of disinformation. And each of these terms comes with a different definition, and it makes sense to keep these definitions precise, to keep them separate from one another, and to make sure that what you are talking about is truly what you want to be talking about. And especially the term fake news is not a friend of yours here, because it deliberately blurs the lines and obfuscates what it is really about, right? By mixing up journalistic error, matter of perspective, editorial lines, unwelcome information, and actual fake cases where somebody disguises themselves or their information as if it were news when it was not. Next, once you have identified what exactly you want to talk about, what exactly your brand of disinformation is, think about just the source. Don't just think about this being in the world. There are a lot of things in the world, a lot of things on the internet that matter very little, that are not read by anybody. So just because, for instance, there is a tweet, just because there is a certain kind of story, it does not necessarily follow that this is a particularly important phenomenon. But the question of disinformation only arises once disinformation actually becomes received as information by people. Right? So only if there is an incorrect claim and people read this as if it were a correct claim do we truly have disinformation. Until then we just have like some text on the internet, and as long as it's just tossed around by between some botnet networks and doesn't reach an audience, or if it just gets flagged as a problematic claim made and therefore not believed, it is not actually effectively disinformation. So we need to also keep in mind that people read a lot of information, a lot of content they get from the internet with quite a bit of a grain of salt. So just because there is an incorrect claim on the internet, that does not necessarily yet constitute a disinformation problem. When you think about why this particular phenomenon deserves attention, think a little bit wider. Think about why is this particular version that I'm looking at right now, at this moment in history, right here in these conditions, such of the form that you are trying to describe, right? They don't just kind of go from the point start from the point that it exists, that we know that, for instance, there is a president, there is a news outlet, there is some kind of website that creates a lot of disinformation. But ask yourself, what is the historical situation in which this came up? Why could this come up? Why would this actor, why would this site be capable of actually creating this? Why would they be able of using this to their advantage? Keep in mind that not all public spheres are American. There are a lot of public spheres that are marked by different assumptions that we bring toward news and toward available information. Keep in mind that there are a lot of contested information environments where the idea that there are contrary claims and conflicting claims is read with much more habit. So keep in mind that all this happens in a context that is much bigger than just the disinformation, and use this in order not just to understand your phenomenon better that you're looking at, but use this also in order to explain why looking at this particular thing that you're looking at really enriches our understanding of disinformation. Now, if you're trying to make a claim about the resonance of incorrect claims, so basically the point when it actually becomes a disinformation problem, right? Like only once people believe this, it can become a problem. Or inversely, if you look at the contestation of incorrect claims, right? Like the efforts that are made in order to fight back and to correct whatever claims are traded. Don't just look at this in terms of either like kind of the information environment and the structure, right? Like the internet, the social media, which throw things into your timeline, or like the role of the press in a certain media system where the press is heavily influenced by political actors. But also don't think of this solely as the making of a particular agent or a particular a politician or a particular multiplier or whatever. Think of these two things together, right? Like in all cases where disinformation is exchanged, both sides matter. Without the person creating disinformation, it doesn't exist. Without the person forwarding disinformation, it does not spread. And without the person regarding disinformation, it does not have an effect. But all of those people act within a specific context that is shaped by the media that we are using, by the digital infrastructures that we are relying upon. So disinformation really can be best understood as a discursive process that is socially embedded, and where no single one difference is sufficient to explain what is going on. Finally, when you think about all these versions of disinformation, beware of totalitarian solutions, right? Like filtering out everything that is incorrect is a represents mostly a severe misunderstanding of the many, many things that roles that information can play in our democratic societies and even in non-democratic societies. Not everything that is incorrect is a danger. Not everything that is a danger can be filtered, and sometimes the filtering is the bigger problem. And the same thing goes for a lot of other kind of radical solutions, right? Like media laws banning certain kind of content, forcing media companies to carry disclaimers that are authorized by some government organizations or fact checkers or whatever. All of these solutions have a bit of a scent of totalitarian responses, and they normally shoot far beyond the aim. So it makes sense to be more careful, to understand that exactly because disinformation is a social process that is complex, that is dynamic, and that involves the people with power, the people in the media, the people who build the digital information infrastructures, just as much as it involves us. It makes sense to understand our own role in this, other people's roles, technology's roles in this process, and try and find a solution that respects all of the legitimate interests in the system and does not just try to get rid of something without properly understanding it first. So with this, I'm concluding my 45 minutes. If you have any comments, questions, and I deliberately did this here in a little bit pointed way, as so as to provoke maybe a little bit of a debate. If you're interested in any of the literature that I used, all of the texts that I put here are quite recommended, and they're very insightful. If you need any further things, feel free to contact me. And other than that, I'm looking forward to the Q&A session where I hope we can discuss this a little bit further. Until then, be well, be safe, be healthy, have a good time.